Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Karen Yarhimilo. I'm the Dean of the school here, the School of International Public Affairs, and the Adlai E. Stevenson Professor of International Relations. What a timely and important event. We are here to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the foundational document of international human rights law, the covenant that defines and protects the basic rights and fundamental freedoms of all human beings. From the communities under attack in Ukraine to the lives of women and girls appended by the Taliban in Afghanistan, to the LGBTQ plus people threatened in Uganda, the protection of human rights is at the forefront of almost every global issue we face. 2 weeks ago, the world watched the horrific terrorist attack against Israeli civilians, the capturing of over 200, including women, children, and elderly, who are now being held hostage by Hamas in Gaza. With Israel's retaliatory strikes and the closure of Gaza, we see a growing humanitarian crisis that is becoming increasingly dire. These events give today's conversation an even greater sense of urgency. It's in times like this that we are reminded why this declaration exists. Though progress has been made in the 7.5 decades since the declaration came into effect, the world faces a long and difficult road ahead for the protection of basic human rights for all. The current infrastructure, the UN Security Council, that is a snapshot of the post-war distribution of power from 3/4 of a century ago, is outdated and unrepresentative of today's global order. We face a backsliding of democracy that has coincided with the reversal of human rights across so many countries. And powerful new technologies are being used to foment violence and infringe on human rights. The need for fresh thinking and new solution is core to my mission, to our mission here at SIPA. It is why we, earlier this month, launched SIPA's Institute of Global Politics, IGP, to bridge the gap between theory and practice and advance innovative and actionable solutions to our toughest challenges. The protection of human rights and freedoms is core to our mission as academic activists. Change starts with protecting the rights of the world's most vulnerable people, those marginalized because of their race, sex, gender, religion, ethnicity, caste, and other identities. Our conversation today will touch on the need to champion the rights of these and other groups and how governments, NGOs, and the private sector can advance human rights 75 years after Eleanor Roosevelt and other firsts made this issue a global priority. I am so pleased to introduce Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton, my partner, my co-teacher, my friend, who will moderate today's discussion with a collective of extraordinary people and renowned advocates for human rights. Besides being former Secretary of State, Secretary Clinton is now a professor at Columbia SIPA and the chair of the Institute of Global Politics Faculty Advisory Board. We're also honored to host 3 of our IGP Distinguished Fellows. First, we have former United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and former President of Chile, Michelle Bachelet, Nobel Peace Prize-Winning Journalist and co-founder, CEO, and President of Rappler, Maria Ressa, and Frank Mugisha, who is a prominent and courageous Ugandan LGBTQ rights advocate, who is also an IGP Distinguished Fellow. We are also delighted to have Allida Black, who is the leading historian on the negotiation of the Declaration and also a Distinguished Fellow at Oxford University's American Institute. Please, everyone, join me in welcoming Secretary Clinton and our esteemed panelists to IGP and SIPA today.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Karen, for that introduction. And it's really a delight, but also incredibly fortuitous that we have this panel gathered here today to discuss the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whose 75th anniversary will be on December 10th. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the Universal Declaration, I really suggest that you read up about it, learn more about it, because it's one of the most extraordinary documents ever conceived by human beings, and one of the, if not the, most widely distributed and read document over the last 75 years. I want to start with Dr. Allida Black, who, as Karen said, is a leading historian of the Universal Declaration, its negotiation, and its interpretation and application over these last years. Allida, will you tell us more about the Universal Declaration, the path to its adoption in 1948, and how has the understanding of this document changed over time?
Thank you, Madam Secretary. I'm a historian on the panel, so for the political scientists, just indulge me for a minute. I want to set the stage for the negotiation of the Declaration. The purpose being now, so many people think that the international rules of law, are imploding. And I want to set the stage for the adoption so that you can make a historical comparison. When Eleanor Roosevelt and delegates from 18 nations began to negotiate the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, this was the backdrop. 15 million soldiers had been killed. 25 million soldiers had been wounded. 2/3 of them required amputation or other types of extraordinary recovery. 45 million civilians were injured. 6 million plus were tortured and egregiously murdered in concentration camps, and more than 50 million refugees. I want to say that again. 50 million refugees were scattered in wretched refugee camps all across Europe. To put that in perspective, that is 100 times more than the highest refugee crisis we've had in the last decade. They're also haunted by the most horrific violence the world has seen in at least a century. You have Stalingrad. You have the firebombing of Dresden. You have the London Blitz. You have Stalingrad and the Battle of the Bulge. You have the Philippines. And you have Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the unimaginable violence that the atomic bomb wrought. And just to give you a vivid illustration of this, if the atomic bomb went off 50 blocks from here, this building would be sand. I'm talking the beams are gone, they're melted down, the concrete, it would be eviscerated. So there was a fundamental choice in this. Because all of this happened 25 years after the end of the First World War, the war to end all wars, the war to make world safe for democracy, and the architect of a very flawed and failed peace. So you have a fundamental decision to make, and that is the world going to be governed by horror, where we react and we have violence and discrimination and polarization and unbridled anger seize every foreign and domestic policy? Or, in fact, we're going to have a vision that stands up to that? Hence the power of the Declaration. Now, I want you to imagine that, all due respect intended, it's at Hunter College. So I want you to imagine that you're going that way to meet at Hunter. You're in a small conference room. You have 18 nations sitting around this table. You don't agree on God or whether God exists. You don't agree on the purpose of government. You don't agree on what citizenship means. You don't agree on who's a citizen. You don't agree on whether there is a right to private property, or whether there is a right to free speech, or the right to organize, the right to travel, the right to an identity. The only thing you have in common is, by God, we beat the Germans. And so when Eleanor Roosevelt comes in to chair this meeting, she makes a fervent plea to all of the members of this nuclear committee, whose job was to figure out how the Declaration could be drafted. And their first charge was to create an international Bill of Rights, something that would be legally adopted and truly form the platform for international law. And she pleads with them to remember that people have identities and consciences and relationships with their own country. So when you negotiate at this table, you negotiated not only as an instructed delegate of your country, but you negotiate as a human being. And it is an incredibly fraught process. Never in the history of the world, as Secretary Clinton said, have people come together to do this. Yes, as a historian, I can argue about Sappho and the right of the soul. Yes, as a historian, I can talk about Cyrus the Great and the concept of humanity in nations. But even with the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, even with our own Constitution, our own Bill of Rights, there are exclusions by law written into those documents. And so the Declaration and the people at that table who were not Western, I don't care what you say, they were not Western only. You have Lebanese, you have African, you have Chinese, you have Indian, you have Americans fighting with the British. And so you have an exceedingly diverse set of voices trying to figure out what this means. And nobody in the history of the world has ever legally defined personhood until 1948. In the shadow of all that horror, when we are defined by who we are not rather than what we are. And so Eleanor Roosevelt conducts more than 300 meetings to negotiate this. They last over 37,000 hours. And I should say that she was drafted into this position by 50 of the 51 nations who were the original members of the United Nations. Anybody want to take a stab who didn't want her? Margot. It's us. The United States did not want her, you know? I mean, because they thought, oh my God, she's going to give, she had 4 years of school. I'm not talking postdoc, I'm not talking college, I'm talking 4 years of school. They thought she was a mushy-headed first lady. You know, they thought, oh my God, this is just the end of it. They put her on the Committee for Humanitarian, Social, and Cultural Concerns because they thought she could deal with museums. Well, the boys, as she called them, the men who were fighting to see who was going to get seats on the Security Council, were totally focused on the bomb. They totally forgot about refugees. And refugees were the major issue that the UN addressed. And so the United States was forced to accept her. Eleanor Roosevelt, working with multiple NGOs from early anti-colonial movements in Africa, the leaders met with her, independence movements from India met with her, anti-Chiang Shek, not real pro-Mao people met with her, Soviet dissidents met with her. She took over 5,000 meetings with individual voices to help shepherd this process. And so what we have is the first time an international document adopted by the largest world bodies defines freedom from and freedom to. You know, you have the social, economic, and cultural concerns on one side, you have political and civil on the other. The hardest article to negotiate was the first, and that is all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and in rights, and are endowed with reason and conscience, and should treat one another in a spirit of brotherhood. I'm going to use this to dovetail into your final question, is that think about this. This is the first time in human history that combatants who were allies but fought each other, who were trying to carve up Europe, who were trying to take possession of the colonies that the United Kingdom is giving up, that the Axis powers were forfeiting, and that came together to agree on a right to an identity, and that men and women and children were all equal under the law. So this passes the General Assembly. Eleanor negotiates with the Soviets to get them to abstain. She goes to Truman and says, if you don't adopt social and economic and cultural rights, I'm going to resign and I'm going to tell the world why. And in the great IGP SIPA model, the person that she takes with her to Truman is John Foster Dulles, who is the hawkiest of hawk Republicans, who was the foreign policy advisor to Thomas Dewey, who almost beat FDR in 44, will almost beat Truman in 48, and she forces the consensus. The other thing that she did was that she met with every person in the UN, the sanitation workers, the food service people, the drivers, the secretariat, the diplomats, because if the language was not clear and totally embraceable, it would fail. And she was right on that. As Secretary Clinton pointed out, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has been used as a model for more constitutions and more governments than any document in history, 6 times as much as the United States Constitution and our Bill of Rights. So why did I lobby to have this panel? Because we now say that the international rule of law is falling apart. You know, that we don't have any courage to do this. I refuse to accept that. If we look at the horror that I started my conversation with, and you look at the vision to be militarily strong and be human rights grounded at the same time, which is what the Declaration was intended to be, it gives us a shrewd platform for going forward.
Thank you so much, Allida, and thanks for the reminders about how challenging it was and what those times were like. I think it's important that we keep that in mind. I want to turn now to Michelle Bachelet. She's had the most remarkable career. First woman elected president in Chile, re-elected when she was able to run again, service at the highest levels of the United Nations. And, you know, Michelle, it seems, as we just heard from Allida, that the ideas behind the Universal Declaration, the language of the Declaration are more relevant and under attack today than they have been in quite some time. From the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, the terrible attacks on Israelis by terrorist groups, to the war in Ukraine, started by a foreign nation that has broken every rule of law, committing war crimes, to gender apartheid in Afghanistan. Clearly, human rights and their protection are under assault everywhere. How, from your experience, should the Universal Declaration help to guide governments and institutions to speak out and stand up for human rights?
Thank you, Hillary. Well, first of all, I want to add to what Allida said, something that is important for me, because being a High Commissioner of Human Rights, many countries came to me and they said, look, that Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a Western construction. And it's not a Western construction. Not only what you said, that it was, I mean, it were the countries that were at that time in the UN. African countries were colonized at that time, so they were not part of the UN. But all the countries who were, they selected all these commissions. But the interesting thing, Eleanor Roosevelt did a fantastic job. But the one, I mean, at that time, people spoke with the French words, les droits de l'homme. So they want to put the rights of men. And there was an Indian woman, a feminist activist, who said, no, if you do that, they will use that against women. So that's why they speak of all human beings, you know, and it's very widespread. So we also, the Chilean one, excuse me, I have to mention him, a commercial. Yeah. He also did a fantastic job on those economic and social rights. There were Peruvians and from many other places. So it's not true that it's not a universal. It's not true that it's a Western construction. I mean, it did include the countries that were represented at that time in the organization. And the other thing is that I think it was only possible, having seen what happens with, and you have seen it personally many times, negotiations of resolution. It was only possible, thanks, if I may say, to the horrors. So humanity understood that we could never go again on something like that.
Absolutely.
Maybe we're wrong, but at that time, that was the objective.
That was it.
And I think, and when I mention this, because many times you talk to different groups, that, of course, there's been changes from 1948 to now. So many people tend to say, look, we have to rediscuss the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and include this and this and that. To be honest, I wouldn't do that. There's no political conditions for that. We probably get something much worse than what we have. And the international community have solved some new issues through resolutions of the Security of the Human Rights Council or the General Assembly, like, for example, defining that a clean environment is a human right. A clean environment is a human right. It was a resolution by the Human Rights Council, and then the General Assembly also a resolution. So many new issues. Some people say, what about artificial intelligence? Should we open again a discussion? And we say, no, there's no conditions for that. It's like a Pandora box we better have and look, because we believe that the main areas of the Universal Declaration can be applied to new challenges. Going back to your question now. Yes, I think marking this year the 75th anniversary of the Human Rights Declaration of Human Rights, we see a lot of pushback on human rights in all regions of the world. You mentioned 3 terrible situations, and these are really sad. So the question is, many of those countries are committed. I mean, there is an architecture for the Universal Declaration. You have the Universal Declaration that has been ratified by many countries, but also you have the Human Rights Council, and that many people from all over the world. I mean, many member states participate then. Then you have all the covenants and the treaties that governments sign to it. Again, the only country in the world that has not signed the Child Convention is the US. And I've been trying to understand why, but okay, probably about the same reasons that you mentioned before. And all the rest, of course, have been ratified. So, so we have the architecture. And what those mean is not just, and the difference with other structures is that countries have, when they sign and ratify this, they are legally binding. It's not that I want to make it or implement it or not. They're legally binding. So they have to go to the council to present their report every 4 years or every 8 years, and they have to make commitments how they're going to solve the lack of human rights or the violation of human rights in the country. So there are some, they're not perfect, as happens in the UN, that sometimes people commit to things, but the implementation may not be there, and that not necessarily accountability for it. I'm not sure it's possible accountability. Maybe we wouldn't have 193 member states, but some type of accountability. Because countries don't want to be name and shame. They don't want to be signed by that, you are the ones who are doing bad things. So I think it needs to be a very smart strategy to try to convince government to align. They need to align their national policies and all the regulatory system to the Universal Declaration principles in terms of ensuring equality, justice, dignity, respect for everyone. But we are facing a very complex situation. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights came after the First World War, but now we're facing a world that is really complex. It has an intersection of different challenges, regional dynamics and local dynamics that makes much more complicated I would say, and there's a new geopolitical order that is very complicated as well. So I think there's much more, and there's third parties' interests who work on these things. So it's really complicated because everybody, if you ask them, and if you go to any meeting, everybody would say, oh, we are champions of human rights. Fantastic speeches. But reality is different. So countries need to walk the talk. And to walk the talk, I think we need on one hand an international community to rebuild a robust approach on human rights and try to think much more on conflict prevention. And I think diplomacy has to play a more important role, not only in preventing conflict, that's not always possible, but at least also trying to figure out how we work with this fragmented international community, because that's something that's really working against it. But the Universal Declaration should be a reference framework that inspires, I would say, national legislations and policies. Governments should align the laws, as I said, and regulations to the principles of these human rights principles. And also, all of this should include non-discrimination, equality before the law, right to life, liberties, and of course, security for all people, because security is also a human right. I think one thing is important, because sometimes you ask yourself, governments are not doing what they should do. I think education and awareness campaigns are really important, and also support for NGOs who are really pushing for human rights everywhere. I think the role of the media is very important to try to show what's going on everywhere in the planet and to let all these violations of human rights be known. And then, so we need to empower people to stand up for human rights, because, and it's also important that people know what human rights are. It's also important, when I was a young mother, I read the Human Rights Declaration in a child format to my children. So they will know which their rights were, so when they grow up, they can so they can demand for their rights, and they can hold governments accountable for it. So it's a mix of things that can do governments, but also things that need to be done by other parts of the society. And so they can also push bottoms up, governments to do the right thing. And also, I think accountability is important. Monitoring mechanisms and accountability mechanisms are important, because you see many times wars in many places. There's a lot of lord wars and so on, and they kill lots of people, they rape women and so on, and then they agree on peace and nothing happens. And when there's impunity, there will be violation of human rights again and again and again, and we've seen it everywhere. So we need to have strong mechanisms for accountability and monitoring, robust and effective, to ensure that human rights are respected and any violation of human rights are addressed, and I would say with seriousness and urgency. As a High Commissioner, I had a very difficult task, because I was supposed to be the voice of the voiceless, but at the same time, I was supposed to work with governments to support them, to give them to capacity building, if it was not intentional, but because they didn't know enough, they didn't have the mechanism. And it's very difficult, because sometimes some governments just deny. They are the perfect place in the world. They're paradise. They don't torture, not at all. They don't have people in prison because they think differently. So it's very difficult. It's not only to talk with them. So you have to find narratives and ways how you talk to those governments, and how you empower other people, and how you find other people. For example, if the national government is not working enough, you can find allies at the local level, at the mayors and others. So you have to find, when you want to change things, have to find which actors you can, push, support, so they can really do the job. I think I'm not very optimistic on the world today, to be honest. Things we took for granted for so many years are just not true. But we need to include that everyone in the world. I mean, the spirit of the Human Rights Declaration includes all of us. And I think that's why it's so important that we respect it, we promote it, and we live our lives, wherever you are in the future, as professional, as diplomats, whatever you are, to try to live and embody those principles. So then you can be also, if I would say, models, because we need models of human rights to be helping other people, the youth, the children, to believe on this and to push for and defend and protect human rights all over the world.
Michelle, I think you made some really important points, and I want to be sure that our audience knows that you have lived this. I mean, you came of age during the Pinochet regime in Chile. You and your mother were forced into exile. You had been, as I recall, your story picked up by the military security personnel of the Pinochet government, mistreated. Your father was also a victim of the Pinochet regime. So this is something that you understand in a way that many people who are in your position could never have. The other point I want to make, which you mentioned, is the name and shame effort. It's fascinating to me how governments who are among the worst human rights abusers don't want to be called out as the human rights abusers. When I was secretary, we had a global survey which looked at people, countries, whether they were complying with human rights. And we would be lobbied just endlessly not to say that they were putting Uyghurs in camps, or that they were driving out Rohingya out of Myanmar, or that they were permitting tribal violence by one tribe against another. That, we were constantly being asked, don't say that, that's not fair, that's not true. And we'd say, well, go fix it, and we won't say it. Yeah. But the name and shame, argument is really powerful, isn't it? Did you find that?
Yeah, indeed. And I would say the same thing. Well, fix it then.
Go fix it.
Yeah, fix it.
If you don't want to be called out, called a human rights violator, an abuser, go fix it.
All countries will. I mean, I had to send the report to the Human Rights Council, so many of these ministers were calling me, oh, I have to explain, this thing is not how you say, so trying to make me change the report.
Yeah. So
they care about it.
They care about it, and I want to underscore that point. This is not something that goes unnoticed. Yeah. They don't want to be called out. They don't want the truth to be disseminated. So that's a very powerful tool for NGOs as well as international organizations. So honestly, I'm sorry. We've got 2 more people to hear from. You have a chance. Well, I'm not sorry. You sit down, and we're going to let other people. We're going to let other people talk. I'm going to turn now to Frank Mugisha. Frank Mugisha is a leading civil rights organizer who is.
President Joe Biden is calling for $100 billion of funding for Israel, Taiwan, and Ukraine, and we're supposed to just bundle these together and pretend like we're going to rush to World War III, and we're all just going to let Hillary Rodham Clinton sit here. Okay.
I'm sorry. You know, this is not the way to have a conversation. If you want to have a conversation, you're welcome to come talk to me afterwards.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
You're going to wait for me, right?
I will wait for you, and I will listen to you, and I will respond to you. But right.
I do not believe.
Well, then just.
The matter is that the American people's voice are what needs to be heard.
Yeah, they are being heard.
The president is not speaking for the American people.
Well, that's your opinion. That's your opinion.
Yes, that's my opinion.
Well, then sit down. We've heard your opinion. Thank you very much. Now we're going to turn to people who are on the front lines of working on behalf of human rights.
I'm going to exercise my free speech.
But it's not free speech when you are disrupting everybody else's opportunity to speak.
This is people constructing narratives that are openly hypocritical. I'm sorry. The incredible hypocrisy.
You know, maybe you could actually.
John Foster Dulles went with Eleanor Roosevelt to bring this Declaration of Rights of Man. John Foster Dulles was involved with the CIA.
Oh, yeah. Well, you're brilliant in your historical cherry picking.
The Pinochet regime.
Oh, listen.
Please inform me about the United States.
Okay, we're going to move on to Frank Mugisha, who's actually on the front lines fighting for human rights, not just yelling about it. So Frank, I want to turn to you because you are from Uganda, and Uganda's 2023 Anti-Homosexuality Act criminalizes LGBTI conduct in Uganda. And, oh, please. Please. Please.
It's not football. This isn't football. It's not Team America.
Well, I'm sorry, but some of us are on Team America despite our flaws and our problems.
And some of us, every person on this stage. Wait, I want to say one thing. Every person on this stage has risked their life, their income, their reputation, their careers, and what have you done other than stand up and disrupt? I will put my record and these women's records and Frank's records against you any day of the year.
Okay.
What I have done is I have asked Hillary Rodham Clinton to denounce the president's openly warmongering, suicidal, idiotic speech.
And I've given my answer. I will not do that. So that's the end of our conversation.
Okay.
But I'll still meet you outside. But you're done. Okay, Frank has been literally on the front lines of standing up for himself and for the LGBTQ community in Uganda. The law that was passed by the Ugandan government, signed by their longtime president, criminalizes LGBTQ conduct. It imposes a life sentence on consensual same-sex conduct among adults. It adds the death penalty. I want you to hear that, the death penalty for what they call aggravated homosexuality or same-sex conduct involving children or people with disabilities. So it is one of the most extreme anti-gay laws in the world. I've followed Frank for years. When I was secretary, I intervened and convinced the president not to sign a law at that time, doing what is now in the law. And I'm just very grateful for Frank's courage, but he had to basically leave his country in order to avoid the consequences of this law. So tell us more about the situation in Uganda, Frank, and what do you believe the international community needs to do to address these human rights abuses?
Thank you so much, Secretary Clinton. First of all, I'd like to appreciate your support on LGBT plus human rights. I think you're among the first politicians who stood up and said in Geneva that LGBT rights are human rights. And I did write an op-ed in the Times about that when you're Secretary of State. Because as communities, we wanted to see politicians who stand up and speak up and support us. And also, you followed Uganda for a long time. In fact, you did engage President Museveni when the law first came. I want to give you a background that this is not an isolated incident. The passing and the introduction of the anti-homosexuality law in Uganda in 2023 is not isolated. It happened before, 10 years ago. This is because of the influence of extreme radicalism that we're seeing happening lately. Before the law was introduced in our parliament, members of parliament, politicians, extreme religious groups went around with targeted, systematic campaigns that were aimed at erasing the livelihood of an LGBTQ plus person in Uganda. I was threatened. I had to live in a safe house. I can't answer my cell phone in Uganda because of the threats I go through. My organization was shut down. I had over 20 charges under surveillance by every security organ in the country. The Ugandans were radicalized into hatred of LGBTQ plus persons. So when the law was introduced in our parliament, it was not as extreme as it was. The death penalty and the other extreme penalties were introduced on the floor of parliament. That would show you how much Ugandans were radicalized into hatred. Some members of parliament were calling for execution, castration of LGBT plus human rights. And these videos are out there in the public. The systematic targeted campaigns were on our local social media, Facebook, and TikTok. And majority of this, actually most of this, was disinformation. And I've called it conspiracy theories aimed at radicalizing Ugandans. So the law was passed, and between the time when the law was started being debated in our parliament until now, we've documented over 300 cases of violations. Many Ugandans are living in fear, LGBTQ plus Ugandans. They are fleeing the country. And you know, leaving the country to safe space is not as easy as it is for someone from the Global South. You need a visa. You need to qualify for the visa. You need a plane ticket. So many LGBT plus persons are actually fleeing to Kenya, which is more dangerous for them as well. What can the international community do? The time is now, really. The reverse. We cannot look at homophobia and transphobia as a Ugandan problem or a problem for the Global South. We are seeing it here. We are seeing transgender rates being reversed here. The progress that has been made in the US is being reversed in 2023. The time is now for the international community to look at this issue as a global issue. The time is now to include LGBT plus human rights in foreign policies and make sure that it is continuous, it is consistent. If an administration changes, they should be consistent. It shouldn't end with that administration. So solidarity is important. There are many people who are not privileged like myself to come here and travel and speak. Many LGBTQ plus persons who are struggling and suffering in countries, many countries, where they can't speak out. There's no voice at all. So solidarity is very important for the LGBT plus community. We need to see voices uplifted. We need to see business leaders. Academia, I'm glad I'm at IGP. The academia is very important. We need data and research. The legislation in Uganda was passed on conspiracy theories, like I said, with no data, no empirical data, nothing, based on totally on conspiracy theories. We need to come up with strong research that is effective, that debunks some of this misinformation that is being peddled by these extreme groups. And unfortunately, I can say it, most of the groups are from here. The extreme conservative groups are from America. My organization has sued one of the American evangelicals called Scott Lively. One, for supporting the legislation in Uganda. Number two, for coming and meeting with Ugandan officials and supporting an extreme anti-gay legislation. Most recently, another American Christian, Sharon Slater from Family Watch International, was in Uganda, supported a conference, which was titled the African Values Conference. And the communique from that conference was encouraging many other African countries to pass similar legislations. And indeed, in Kenya, they tried to bring up a similar legislation. So I wanted to conclude and say that the solidarity is the most important part that is needed right now, but also for us to look at this issue as a global issue. Thank you so much.
You know, I think what Frank said is something that everybody should recognize, and that is that some of the human rights abuses, but particularly this campaign against LGBTQ plus people, often starts outside a country. It is funded and supported, in the case that Frank's talking about in Uganda, by very conservative religious groups, fundamentalist Christian evangelical groups, who have been working on this issue for more than a decade to try to get laws changed to marginalize and even criminalize LGBTQ people. So this is not indigenous, and it's not something that just came up from the grassroots of the people in Uganda. This was organized, orchestrated, funded, implemented, and now they're trying to take that campaign into other countries in Africa as well. And some of that was also aided and abetted by Putin and his Russian policy, which took on a very strident anti-gay position starting in about 2010, where, aligned with the Russian Orthodox Church, they began passing laws, they began preventing pride parades and other kinds of activities. And then part of the sale that Putin was making to African leaders was, we also are against the LGBTQ community, so let the Wagner army come in and operate in your country. So there's, the connections here are much deeper and frankly wider than is often reported. So I think it's really critical that you made that larger point. Let me move on to Maria Ressa, who also has been on the front lines of defending human rights, her own and others, speaking out journalistically for many years now against the violation of human rights. And one thing you're focused on here, Maria, at the Institute is the relationship between artificial intelligence and democracy. And keying off of what Frank said, the disinformation that was used in Uganda that we're seeing in so many places, how is this mis- and disinformation campaign, really undermining not just privacy, but rights? And if we're thinking about regulating artificial intelligence, how do we keep human rights as central to the design and regulation?
Thank you for the question. I mean, at the Nobel lecture, I actually said we have to go back to the days of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because it is as existential a moment as it was then. And those statistics, actually listening to you, Allida, gave me hope. It's not as bad as we think it is where we came from. So that's, see, you're smiling like I was. I was like, oh, I didn't know that many people had died or had been. So at the Nobel lecture, I said that we have to stop humanity from doing the worst of humanity. There have been two contact of humanity with AI. And we're talking a lot about generative AI right now, but what we haven't talked about as much are the harms that we use. I mean, I'm guilty, I use social media. If you're streaming on social media, right, everything you post is data about you. You have been cloned, and without your permission, your clone has been pulled up by AI into a micro-targeting. I talk about it as how we are essentially Pavlov's dogs, right? Micro-targeting is not old-style advertising. It is hitting you at your weakest moment to a message. It also does things because of the business model, because it isn't a government that is trying to protect its people. It does things like give a bully pulpit to the most extreme 6% of anything. So for example, one person stood up in the room. What happened to the rest of us, right? Hillary kind of talked, Allida jumped in, and then we had some nice people come. But one person dictated what we were all doing in that moment on social media. The extreme 6% determined the cause. And here's the hard part. What if those extreme 6% are related to geopolitical power play? Which, by the way, is what happened in the US elections in that 2016, the year when the political dominoes began to fall. I know President Duterte was elected in the Philippines. About a month later, we had the vote in Brexit in London. You had the US elections. The irony, of course, watching this, you know, I think we get affected by this, but watching this reminded me of the Theodore Roosevelt quote, right? In the ring. And this woman has been the most targeted of Russian disinformation. 126 million Americans were touched by that. Do you know how you were nudged? Do you know how you were manipulated? That insidious manipulation, that harm, that shifting in our emotions, in our amygdala, to shift the way we see the world and the way we vote. Those are the first generation AI. Journalists have no defense against this because we are attacked. Not attacked as much as Hillary Clinton was, but I was getting 90 hate messages per hour for months, right? What do you do with that? That isn't real, but that is power pounding you to silence, enabled by the tech, right? So that's the first instance. If you have no integrity of facts, you cannot have integrity of elections. If you're too busy yelling, you cannot go through the listening that a democracy requires. If you're too busy yelling, you can't actually find common ground, which is what the first tearing down, the business model of social media, which is surveillance capitalism, right? That tore our reality apart. We're seeing that play out with Israel, Hamas, Palestine today, right? Because in 2018, MIT said lies spread 6 times faster. But since Elon Musk took over Twitter, it's significantly worse. And he set the bar so low, every American social media company followed. We haven't gone into generative AI yet. Have I laid out bleak? Here's where it's not bleak, right? You talked about name and shame. Today, name and shame doesn't work if an exponential lie can be said 1 million times and it becomes a fact. If Russian disinformation is manipulating you insidiously, if Chinese, the disinformation Taiwan is getting right now coming out of China, we in the Philippines have tracked both Russian and Chinese disinformation. Let's not call it that because it has a lot of other things attached. Let's call it information operations. That's kind of muted. What you went through here is information warfare. Do you know you're in the middle of a war? If you think it's out there, you are. It's here. And you must take these elements, the values of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Don't scream and shout. Use it, be it. We need to actually, journalists can't do this alone. Governments can't do this alone. You're going to need to come in and form your own communities of action and redefine what civic engagement means in the age of exponential lies. And you guys are all so smart. We got to do it now. Sorry, this is it's a brave new world, guys, and we have to rise up to the challenge.
Maria, can you talk a little bit about some of the journalism that you did showing how governments in places like Myanmar, the Philippines, Indonesia, elsewhere, used information operations, information warfare to carry out their own nationalistic, ideological objectives?
Sure. I mean, the Philippines is a perfect example of Milan Kundera's quote, "The struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting." The information operations to begin to sanitize the name Marcos began as early as 2014. That again was an interesting year, right? Because that was when Russian information operations began that led to the annexation of Crimea. The same meta-narrative set in place that was used in 2022 by Putin to invade Ukraine itself, right? So you see, this is a world of lie a million times and then seeding something that then is always brought up at opportune moments, like now. This is an opportune moment when your emotions are high. So Marcos began his information operations, YouTube, Facebook video. He was a Jedi Knight first, right? It was about changing the name Marcos from the kleptocrat who stole $10 billion and was kicked out by the Filipino people in 1986 in what was known as the People Power Revolt. That was the beginning of all these people power movements all around the world where we thought democracy was going to always be around. Now we know how fragile democracy is, right? From 2014 until Bongbong Marcos, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the only son and namesake of Marcos the dictator who was ousted, ran for vice president in 2016. He lost by just 200,000 votes. You met the woman who won, the vice president, Leni Robredo. They both ran against each other for president in 2022. He won overwhelmingly. And when you go to some of the poorest neighborhoods of our capital, Manila, and you ask people why they voted for Marcos, many of them told us, well, because I'm gonna get gold. Really? Where did you hear you were gonna get gold? YouTube. There was a myth of Italiano gold, right? The way to cover up stealing, the kleptocracy, was to say they had gold and you would get some of it, and it would bypass those very slow governments that just doesn't give you what you deserve. So we've elected President Marcos. And, I mean, to be fair, we came from a place that was so low when we have no idea how many people were killed daily. The police themselves estimated 33 people killed every night in the first years of the Duterte administration. The bar was so low that President Marcos is not so bad. He's actually, I had in 2019 10 arrest warrants in a little over a year, and all those cases, only 2 are left. Still hanging over Rappler, we could still get shut down. And that's why we continue to fight the much more difficult fight of governance, justice, and information, to try to get you the information you need to make the right decisions in your life.
Well, I think you've heard from 4 remarkable people who understand, often in very personal ways, why the human rights that were, for the first time ever, described in the Universal Declaration are critical to who we are, what kind of futures we'll have, and we face all of these challenges. So my last question to each of you will be, how optimistic are you that, especially given the power of social media, now of AI, generative AI, which is literally going to be putting, fake videos in front of you of people saying things they've never said, of candidates being characterized in ways that are both wildly favorable and wildly unfavorable, not based on facts, but on manipulation. So given all of that, how optimistic are you that we can come together in some forum, somehow, somewhere, to try to restore the meaning of the Universal Declaration and actually, begin to use it as a tool to hold people accountable. Allida?
I'm optimistic. I'm also very stubborn. But I do think that it's each of us. I mean, if we separate ourselves from what's going on, and if we don't really think about what rights mean in a way that is practical and effective and courage-inspiring, we're going to fail. I mean, my standard line about this is there's a right to water. Okay. We have so co-opted that right that it means that I have a right to a Coca-Cola with ice in a green plastic glass with a flamingo on top in the middle of the Sahara Desert with nobody around me. And we have internalized that in the wrong way. I mean, I went back to look at a lot of what Carlos Romulo and who was really a major impetus in the Declaration, and Hans Meta, who got all human beings in, to go back and look. And, there was a New Yorker cartoon that just destroyed me 20 years ago. And it was every soldier of every religion in the cartoon. And the line under it was, all God's children's got guns. If you look at the underlying fundamental gut level DNA fiber of the people who negotiated the Declaration, it's I am a person because of you. It is Ubuntu. And that means if somebody's going after Maria, or somebody's going after my friend Hillary, or somebody's going after Michelle Bachelet, for whom I would stand in front of a speeding truck, it is my responsibility to figure out how to effectively do this. How do you build a coalition? Is it one voice? But if we say this doesn't matter, we just open the gates for all this AI. We have got to believe in ourselves and figure out how to trust one another. That doesn't mean we have to trust each other on everything, but I am not going to let these bastards take my joy and take my love away for brave people in the world and people who risk themselves to try to address what we don't have the guts to do. And I really believe with all I am, that's the first thing that we have to do. Then we can be trained to organize. We can train to do policy, but we have got to figure out how to stand up for each other in a way that allows us to be different, but be safe.
Maria.
Every world religion, and I go to religion because religion is connected to faith. Every world religion has the equivalence of do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's a central tenet. Look, everyone here knows we have our moments that are really, oh my God, you turn the TV on today and it's scary. But here's the thing, the reason why I'm here, the reason why we're doing our work at IGP is because we're looking at executions that can change that, right? And it will be about civil society. It will be about tech for good. It will be about us to take what Allida said, right? It's the same theme, the same question I asked in my book, How to Stand Up to a Dictator, which is, this moment is it for us. I've never lived through anything like this. By February, I'll have been a journalist for 38 years. And I've covered everything, and I have never lived through anything like this. So the question in my book is, we were forced to confront what we're willing to give up, what we're willing to sacrifice for the facts, for our shared reality. So the question for each of you is the same. What are you willing to sacrifice? And the reason I have hope is because I met you guys here for the last month, right? And I know this is a great starting point. It's only the starting point. There's a heck of a lot of work to do. In the Philippines, we're strangely coming out of things. So there is hope. You just have to stay the course. I'll end with this, right? Look, in the Nobel lecture in Hiroshima, that atom bomb killed 140,000 people like this. In Nagasaki, it was about 65,000 people. We could have destroyed, humanity could have been destroyed. This moment in time is far worse than what she just described. Because if we don't have a shared reality, we cannot deal with climate, which is literally the earth we live on. So let's build. It's time to build. Step on the rubble of the world that was. And despite the anger, the fear, we need to build communities of action who believe in these values. They're still as important today as they were when they were formulated, and please stand up for them.
Thank you, Maria. Frank.
Thank you so much. When you talk about the Declaration on Human Rights, for example, in Uganda and other countries, authoritarian governments who really are abusing human rights, that's when many of our leaders remember to assert their sovereignty. But I would like to say my optimism is that our local courts agree with us, because many of our constitutions were drafted and some of the language was from the Declaration. The litigation that we are doing in Uganda at the moment, we're using many aspects of the Declaration. For the first time in Massachusetts, when we sued the Christian evangelical here, the judge said persecution of LGBTQ persons could amount to crimes against humanity. So such small steps give me a lot of hope and optimism. But also I'd like to end by saying we're a very resilient movement. We're not going to allow to see all this backlash and reversal of human rights that we have strongly fought for and struggled for. I believe that we'll definitely rise up at some point. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Michelle.
Well, my answer would be, it would look that I'm confused, but I'm not confused, I can assure you, because I would tell you, I declare myself as a strategic optimist, but not necessarily in the tactic part optimistic, because I think the world is going into a very complex situation. All of the things you mentioned, Hillary, but also if you think of the geopolitics today, many times that is so important at the moment to make decisions that unfortunately sometimes loses the sight of what's happening to real people, how people is suffering. And so I'm not, and also after COVID-19, I thought, okay, as the Human Rights Declaration of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration, maybe COVID-19 will be the possibility of feeling, people seeing that we came to this pandemic because there was normalized things that were not normal, because there was so much inequality in the world, people were not prepared, etc. So I thought, okay, after COVID, people will say, no, we need to do things differently. We need to organize society differently. We need to have a new social contract in our countries. We need to change things, because how countries were delivering the economic system, the social system came to, I mean, COVID did not produce what it produced by itself. It only laid bare the inequalities in societies between countries and so on. And one of my concerns as well is the lack of confidence of people in democracy. If you see a lot of, polls in many places, people feel that democracy is not important, that it's more important an authoritarian, efficient regime than a democracy. And I believe there's no human rights possible without democracy. And also I think there's no human rights and democracy without women's participation. And we see a backlash also on the last resolution of the Health Summit. There's not, the gender concept disappeared completely from the resolutions of the UN. I still don't know why. I want to discover, because that was one of our fights when I was UN Women Executive Director on the gender concept. And secondly, not even the word women were included in resolution. So something's going on, is a real pushback on women's rights, but also on democracy. And we see the rise of extremists and also ultra-right movements talking about, calling for leaving women's rights under the table, if I may say, labor's right, and so on and so on. So I'm really concerned about that. Because in my country, there was a survey. I was in jail with Pinochet dictatorship. My father died because of torture. Me and my mother were expelled from the country because of that. But I never, and so I know what it is like that, as you mentioned, and I thank you for mentioning that. But the thing is that I see in my country, young people was not born on the coup d'etat. They were born afterwards, 70%. So you ask young people, and there's a group of young people say that the best government in Chile's history is Pinochet's regime. And it was a terrible dictatorship. So I'm concerned. And this happens in many places. When you see 9 countries in Africa had coup d'etat, and people were applauding the coup d'etat. Why? Because democracy is not delivering. Because democracy is not being relevant and is not answering the needs of the people. So we need to work on human rights, but we need to also ensure how we strengthen democracy, its mechanisms, institutions, how we make people understand that it's not a perfect system, but it's the best system that we can have, and can also have mechanisms to correct what is not perfect. And we need to do that, because otherwise we're not going to have neither human rights nor anything. But lastly, we were in jail, we were in exile, but so I'm not optimistic on the present moment, but that doesn't mean that I give up, because we were 17 years under the Pinochet dictatorship, and I went back and I worked underground, and we were always working for recovered democracy. So I would say, optimistically, I think we cannot give up. And when I'm saying in the long term, I'm not saying to wait for the long term, I'm saying that we need to continue working, as we have heard from all of you, to ensure that democracy is a reality, that we can ensure that people's needs are in the front pages of the policies of the countries, but also in the international communities, that women's rights are really respected, that child's rights are respected. And I think that in the long term, I always use, but I will always give the credits to Desmond Tutu, the Archbishop of South Africa. And he was really important in the fight against apartheid. And he died a couple of years ago. Huh? And he always said his slogan was, "I'm a prisoner of hope." And many times when I was High Commissioner, sometimes everything was so bad, so bad. I remember, no, I have to be a hostage or a prisoner of hope. I cannot give up. If we give up, we better go back. We just resign and go and sleep and whatever. And I don't recommend you any of those. You're young, you still have the energy, the enthusiasm, as Maria was saying, so you can really stand up for all these values that are essential in every one of your countries. You have so much that you can give to the world. So we really are looking forward for you to take the flame and continue with this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I can't imagine 4 better people to try to both describe not just the Universal Declaration, but what it's meant and all of the challenges to it, but also provide a call to action. And that is something that we are in great need of, every one of us. So
Hillary, sorry, can I thank you for something?
Yeah.
Because you have done something probably was not, you acknowledge that, but you brought Latin American, African, and Asian, and an American. So thank you for that as well.
Oh, yeah.
Because you represent the world. Sorry, I just wanted to thank you for that.
Well, it is the Institute of Global Politics.
Yeah, I know.
Not American politics. So we want to be sure that we have as many, people who have the kind of deep experience and knowledge that these 4 do to, be part of what we're building here. It means a lot to us. So let's give another round of applause to our incredible panel.
Yay!
I think we have one more picture of you.